Over the decades since its release, people across the speedrunning community have dissected and studied everything you could possibly ever want to know about Super Mario 64 and how its mechanics work. This level of understanding allowed for insane speedruns, such as the 0-star tool-assisted speedrun, or TAS for short, in 4 minutes and 20 seconds that, despite its short length, required Bismuth to dedicate 38 entire minutes to explaining it. These explanations sound at times like they are describing completely made-up concepts, like the infamous parallel universes, so it can become quite difficult to follow everything that is happening on the finest levels of detail. But what if someone with ill intentions were to combine this technical knowledge with people's blind trust in experts in order to fabricate lies? Enter JJ902. Have you ever wondered why all of these restrictions are in place for SM64 speedruns? And what even is the Hold L glitch? The reason behind why this particular glitch is banned is the speedrunner JJ902, who was active during the early days of speedrunning around 2009 to 2011. By the way, I apologize for the relatively low amount of direct footage from 2009, because back then basically no one was actually saving stream VODs, and also JJ ended up deleting all of his YouTube videos, but we were able to save at least a few of them, so I will have to milk the few clips that we have for all it's worth. Sorry. After starting his speedrunning career in 2009, JJ902 was not particularly known for setting many or even any records at all, but that is because he mainly focused on finding new tricks and skips. Whenever any category of any speedrun gets seemingly pushed to its limits, it is always the glitch hunters and skip finders like Sockfolder, who was the first one to find a consistent setup for canonless, who pushed the speedrun to the next level and allow for new time barriers to be broken. Let's take an example. This is the starting section of Bob on Battlefield. To the right, you have both a ramp and an elevator that lead to the upper section of Bob on Battlefield, where speedrunners will usually perform the bomb clip to grab the star behind the chain chomp's gate. To the left is a path under the tilting bridge that speedrunners will use to quickly climb the mountain. Climbing up the slope, however, can be somewhat slow, and this is where JJ902 made his first move. If we go back to the very start of the stage, we can see green hills to the side, which seem to simply function as the barrier of the stage and mark where the playable area ends. For speedrunners, however, this is not just a hill, but a slope. And slopes are full of untapped potential just waiting to be unleashed. By sliding down the slope on Mario's butt, he will quickly gain a lot of speed that can then be preserved by jumping off the slope. The speed, however, would of course be lost once Mario landed. However, there are various tricks, such as most notably the speed kick, which allows Mario to conserve his speed for a little while and not lose it all immediately. And then what do we do with that speed? We jump really high. As Bismuth already pointed out in his 0-star TAS explanation video from earlier, Mario's double jump gains more height the more speed he has. Therefore, you could slide and jump off a slope, do speed kicks to conserve your speed while you position Mario where you need him to, and then unleash that speed into a massive double jump that reaches all the way to the upper part of Bob on Battlefield. Here you can then further conserve your speed with a glitchy wall kick and another double jump to more quickly reach the Bob on Tower. While this sequence of moves has been examined before and was at the time known as a theory, JJ902 would be the first person to actually execute all of these moves in real time, even the glitchy wall kick, which is the hardest part of the entire sequence. Even to this day, this level of movement is mainly reserved for tool-assisted play, so was JJ902 really that good? Or was he playing on an emulator and made the rookie mistake of trying to pass off clearly inhuman task movement as inputs done by a real person? Well, there was one major problem with this theory. JJ902 was playing on a real Nintendo 64 with a Super Mario 64 cartridge. It was of course well known you could just play a modified ROM of the game on an emulator, but JJ902 always played on a real Nintendo 64 using an SM64 cartridge, so clearly his input must have been legit. And beyond that, JJ's knowledge of how the game worked seemed to be on a different level entirely for the time. Today, with all the extensive knowledge we have, we do for example know that precise slide kick cancels could actually conserve and even gain speed, but JJ was already using the strategy back in 2010. Since the exact mechanics of this were not yet understood and similar movement options like just long jumping seemed to be just as fast, people did not pay much attention to this strategy. Most speedrunners thought that these slide kicks were simply another quirk of his. And I say another because JJ would often bookend some of his statements, explanations, or even just to fill the air after he made a mistake by using this one phrase that he loved way too much. Let that sink in.
Oof, let that sink in. Oof, let that sink in. Let that sink in.
At least it's good to know that since the early days of speedrunning, our collective humor has evolved drastically and we aren't simply repeating the same words or phrases for comedic effect. Maybe speedrunners should have taken him more seriously back then, however, as this was just the beginning of the madness. JJ902 would make video after video about various skips and tricks that he reported to have found, and each and every one of these would require insanely precise inputs. He would attempt to teach people why these inputs have to be so precise by talking about the game's code and hex values, but he would then actually perform these skips on his N64 to prove that they are in fact legit. These tricks would include, but were not limited to, storing and then triggering a second backflip in mid-air, clipping through the bottom of Peach's slide by exploiting a misalignment, the frame walk, which people do actually use in some places nowadays, specifically in Jolly Roger Bay.
Plugged in as well. There he goes. Here he goes.
A different method of cannonless.
Massing on the... And he's made it.
Oh, he's in there.
And a way to use the slide kick to gain even more speed than should otherwise be possible, dubbed the JJ slide kick. I need to understand that some of these, like the framework I mentioned, are legitimate and used to this day, so whenever people did try out what he showed off in his videos, they would sometimes find success. So people naturally assumed that these tricks simply required an insane amount of precision that would take a lot of effort and focus to learn and execute, and that JJ, with his intimate knowledge of the game's code, had an advantage in not just finding, but also executing these strategies. And that was also usually the reaction whenever people weren't able to actually replicate what he was demonstrating, and why he was not more closely examined at the time. Besides, most of these were more like little curiosities, or at best some extremely risky ways to save just fractions of a second that were not worth using anyway, even if they would work. It's not like he suddenly found tricks that would revolutionize all of Super Mario 64 speedrunning. More video essays like this are in the works, so if you enjoy what you're seeing, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Thank you very much. Okay, so this next one is admittedly a bit far out there, or rather, far up there. This is the JJ triple, or simply known as the TTM upwarp, even though it's not technically an upwarp. For this trick, he reported using a highly specific spot at the beginning of Tall Mountain, where two polygons were visibly not aligned correctly, and by abusing a misalignment between them and an absurdly precise angle on the control stick out of 65,000 possible angles, Mario would gain an extreme amount of vertical speed, allowing him to jump to the top of TTM. People back then probably felt the same about this as they did about Pankirk's explanations of parallel universes, but unlike him, JJ's TTM upward video did not become a well-known video the world over. Speedrunners simply tried and failed to replicate this trick, and every time someone asked JJ about what they were doing wrong, he would simply state that they just weren't aligned to the correct subunit, and other such explanations. Despite this trick's seeming impossibility, JJ's success rate at hitting this trick on his N64 was around 2%, which is actually much higher than it sounds when you keep in mind that everyone else had 0% success rate. This now meant that JJ had the ability to set IL world records for TTM that no one else would be able to beat, cementing himself as a speedrunner that was operating on a completely different level than anyone else. Of course, looking at the title of this video, you already know that this trick was never legit, but how did he still manage to pull it off on a real N64 console? Now, some of you might already be thinking, what if he actually made a video of two-assisted speedrun and then simply played it back on his TV and only pretended to play? Well, that is a method of cheating that has in fact been used before a few times, but I can reveal to you right now that no, this was not the way that JJ was cheating. He was indeed actually playing with his real inputs on an unmodified Nintendo 64. Even despite all of this, however, this was still just for ILs, which are individual level speedruns, which most people don't really care about anyway, and maybe JJ would have been able to get away with his machinations for at least a few more years, if it weren't for the most bizarre turn in this entire story. Because next, JJ902 did not just find another real skip, he also found what could be one of the potentially biggest skips in all of Super Mario 64 history. Now this is going to get a little bit technical, but I'm going to try and break it down as much as possible for you guys. In late 2010, JJ would upload a video titled New Toad Skip, in which he explained that the game stored a pointer to the current interactable object with a text box that you just interacted with, which is mainly signs that you can read, but also includes toads, since they are just signs with a pulse. He also noticed that through this pointer, the interactable object's rotation angle along the z-axis was accessed, which is used to make sure that Mario faces the object, and if the object can rotate, like toads, they will face Mario as well, using a rotation function that can be called on the object to rotate the object into the correct orientation to face Mario. Another interactable object, however, is the key door to the second floor of Peach's castle, which of course does not have to turn to face Mario because it's a door. Additionally, when the upstairs key door is interacted with, the game will check if the value at this fixed address, which I'm just going to call OXOC from now on, is set to 1. And only then will it allow the door to be opened. This value is usually derived from the presence of the second key in Mario's possession, which of course you get from beating the downstairs boss in the fire sea. We're sort of starting the puzzle come together, but the last piece of the puzzle is what I mentioned just a few seconds ago. That some interactable objects need to rotate themselves to face Mario, but not all of them. The call for the rotation of the object is a function that is called on an object and as an input value uses the rotation of the object that it is supposed to be set to. However, since the door is a fixed object and therefore cannot rotate to face Mario, if we were to somehow attempt to call this function on the upstairs key door, it turns out that it would actually cause an unintended behavior in the code that ultimately leads to the game setting not the door's rotation value, but actually sets a completely different memory value. A memory value that happens to be right next to OXOC. So we're close, but we're not quite there yet. In the way that Super Mario 64 uses floating point values, there is a known rounding error that can happen when you call this rotation function with an input of value 86 or about 1.5 in radians. And to inform the function that a rounding error will occur and that the function should instead use an alternate calculation that it doesn't run into this rounding error for 86, a secondary byte is set next to the rotation value, but only if the input value is 86. And this additional byte is exactly the key that we need to unlock this door. What would happen in theory is the following. If the rotation function would be called on the key door with the angle 86, this rotation value would then get written into this garbage memory address right next to OXOC, but then the rounding correction byte gets written into OXOC itself. And that byte is true, which means 1. So just perform this glitch on any door and we got the second key, right? Well, not quite that simple. Just performing this glitch once at any time with any door is not enough to make the game think you have the second key, however, since interacting with any door again would reset this value based on you either having or not having the second key in your possession, which means that this glitch needs to be performed directly on the second floor key door at the very moment that you want to go through it. Well, hold on, all of this is just conjecture. We haven't even figured out yet how we're supposed to even call the rotation function on this door. It's supposed to not have access to it in the first place. JJ902 had the answer, and the answer is the hold L glitch. You may have heard of the hold R glitch before in Ocarina of Time, also known as hold R lol, where the developers apparently left an oversight in the game's code regarding the R button in the 1.0 and 1.0 version of the game. If you held down the R button during the trading quest chain and talking to King Zora while he tries to give you the Zora tunic, he would instead give you a later item in the trading quest chain, the eyeball frog. Oversights like this can be somewhat common in games, and so JJ902 likely was searching for these kinds of occurrences to give him an advantage. And what he found was that by holding down the L button in the lobby of Peach's castle specifically, the game would check for the presence of a key on every frame the button was held. Now this check by itself doesn't do anything apparently, so it seemed useless at first. However, this check also serves an important function. Since this check is usually performed while interacting with the key door, this check makes it so no other interaction can start on that frame. This means that if you hold down this button and then attempt to talk to a Toad, the interaction with Toad will not begin. However, the game still recognizes that you talk to Toad, so the pointer towards Toad and its rotation angle is stored. So now, don't blink. If we hold down L, store the interaction with Toad, and then with precise movement make it so Toad would be facing exactly angle 86, and then release the L button the moment we're able to interact with the key door, the interaction with the door is started on the same frame that the rotation set function is called, and it's called on the door thinking that it's being called on Toad with the value of 86, which temporarily makes the door believe that we have the key to the second floor and allows Mario to walk through. And then the trick was immediately banned from all major categories. There were some issues with the skip. First off, it only worked on the Japanese and American 1.0 versions of the game, meaning that the PAL version distributed in Europe, which by the way I would have access to, or later versions such as the Shindo version or the IQ version, could not perform this glitch. Secondly, this glitch was clearly using an unintended leftover debug function and left a sour taste in people's mouths, since making use of this function just makes it feel like you're not even playing Super Mario 64 at that point. Unlike in Ocarina of Time, the community for SM64 decided swiftly and immediately to ban the glitch in order to maintain the integrity of the leaderboards. And to be fair, the way that Zero Star is currently run is, I would say, a lot more fun and a lot more interesting than simply using a developer debug function and 2 BLJs to skip to the final boss immediately. But hold on a second, isn't this video about a cheater? I may not have been entirely truthful to you, and I may have reconstructed the actual order of events in which this entire glitch was found. You see, when JJ first uploaded that new Toad skip video, the skip hadn't yet actually come together and he only figured out part of the skip. And specifically the hold L part of it was missing from the video. Now, he did later find out how to complete the skip that he theorized in the video, and he showed it off to a few other speedrunners in private, but before he could publicly talk about all of this, his friends told him that it would make more sense if instead he would actually show the skip off for the very first time live in front of an audience at HDQ 2011 as part of a bonus run. Now, this video has gone on for a long time already, so if you want to hear more about specifically this story about what happened at HDQ 2011, the speedrunner and content creator Simpleflips had already gone over this incident in detail in his video on JJ902, so I will link his video in the description and you can check out that particular debacle in more detail. The long and short of it is that JJ had to play on a championship cartridge that had a version of SM64 on it that would not have allowed for the glitch in the first place, and instead of making a stink about it, he simply took the L and moved on. And shortly after HDQ 2011, he then left speedrunning behind entirely. And so, he just disappeared for many years. I may have also made it sound like no one was at all suspicious about him, but there were 4 people in particular that were already looking into all of his claims and trying to figure out how he was cheating, and sometime later, it was actually proven and later admitted by JJ himself that he did cheat and also how he cheated. So, how did JJ902 achieve his seemingly impossible tricks on a real N64? The cartridge. The knowledge how to inject a modified ROM onto a real cartridge that plays on a real N64 was at that point not yet widespread. So this method was not considered as much as it should have been, and I cannot blame any of the speedrunners at the time for not looking more deeply into this possibility, since no one even assumed that this would be a possibility. On top of that, his in-depth knowledge of the game was so extensive, and some of the things he did were in fact really possible, that he was given the benefit of the doubt over and over. He knew what he was talking about, he knew what he was doing, and he also knew that people can be very quick to trust people that are purportedly seasoned experts on a topic, and that if he bullshitted hard enough about technical details, that a lot of people can be made to believe anything. Now, what was actually different about his cartridge? Well, he simply added additional small functions that, for example, allowed him to jump further or higher when buttons on the D-pad were pressed, or simply gain a bit more speed. This means that tricks that, for example, required a certain amount of speed or jump height would be not only much easier, but even bad execution would make the trick maybe not fail at all. You could also find additional skips and tricks that would only work on his modified cartridge, but using his technical knowledge as a smokescreen, he would be able to convince some people that this was actually possible on an unmodified Super Mario 64 cartridge. In retrospect, looking at all of the evidence, the fact that someone was able to, as far back as 2009, go into the game's code and examine hex values, should have tipped us off that maybe, just maybe, him injecting a ROM onto a real cartridge may not have been all that impossible. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope I was able to teach you at least a little bit more about SM64 speedrunning history. And if you show this video to your friends, remember to also tell them to be wary of people that have technical knowledge that you blindly trust. I'm the Rosielim. See you next time.